Scary Eire. Eire is the Irish or Gaelic word for Ireland. Paranormal means all the things that are impossible to explain by known natural forces or by science. And Ireland is steeped in lore, ghosts, blood, sweat, tears, sacrifice, hunger, desperation, and charm. Oh, and the paranormal. Welcome to Scary Eire.
Mark Manning.
Come on in, the water's warm, and welcome to Scary Eire. We're going to County Fermanagh on the north of Ireland, so we are. We're going to talk paranormally type stuff, and even a bit of enlightenment on today's Scary Eire. Eire.
Oh, so that's what it sounds like backwards.
Remember, I cannot have a show without your participation.
Email any observations you have or experiences you have had to paranormalireland@protonmail.com.
paranormalireland@protonmail.com.
Please just like and subscribe on whatever platform you're on now. Like and subscribe. My thanks, of course, as always, goes to Paranormal UK Radio for hosting me and my blessed show. And if you stick around, this is going to be a pretty blessed show. More anon. Like my bit of Latin? Please yourself. We had this guest on and he was amazing. Guy called Kieran Fanning. He'd just written a book, which is still available, called Haunted Ireland. And he allows us to draw liberally from it, which we're about to do, courtesy of David McGlynn, a.k.a. the Squire. We're going to hear the story of the Cooneen ghost house and the poltergeist goings-on within. So settle down, take the weight off your face. The Cooneen ghost house is believed to be the only house in Ireland in which an exorcism was carried out. By the way, stick around because later in the show we'll be talking to a Catholic priest of 40 years about exorcism and other blessed things. But first, I dare you to listen to what follows with the lights off. And if you're brave, make sure you've got a clean pair of underpants, panties, whatever, sitting beside you, 'cause you're gonna be needing them. Kiddo, it's time to join the Squire, a.k.a. David McGlynn, and listen up as he relates a true story, and it is true, about the poltergeist of Cooneen House.
What brought a poltergeist into the little house in the woods, nobody knows. But some people say that a man had once been killed there. The widow Bridget Murphy knew nothing of this when she moved into the house with her adult son and 6 young daughters. Although if she had done her research, she might have had second thoughts about moving in, because the building had had many owners, each of whom had only stayed a short while. Indeed, the Sherry family she had bought the house from had only stayed there one night before selling it on. For a while, the Murphy family were happy there, but the trouble started one autumn night in 1913, when the children were in bed and Bridget was nodding off by the fire. She was awoken by footsteps in the loft. Bridget knew it couldn't be any of the children, because James was asleep in one bedroom and the girls in another. Furthermore, the loft was used to store hay and could only be accessed via the stairs from outside. She lit a candle and went into the loft to investigate, but there was nobody there. She checked the bedrooms, but her children were still sleeping. She'd only just sat down by the fire again when a loud bang made her jump. One of the girls woke up screaming, and Bridget rushed in to comfort her. The banging noise, which seemed to be coming from the walls, came again and again, waking the rest of the girls and Bridget's 25-year-old son. "Make it stop," wailed Catherine, the second youngest. The noises in the walls continued all night, and only ceased with the arrival of the first rays of morning sunlight. They started again the following night, and the night after. Exhausted and terrified, Bridget sought the help of the local priest. Father Peter Smith turned up to investigate and asked if he could stay the night. While the family slept, Smith, armed with his Bible and holy water, stayed awake. In the silent darkness, he waited and waited. And then it came. A sweeping noise, like rustling straw, blew into the room, followed by taps and then loud bangs in the walls. The Murphys all woke and huddled in terror with the priest beside the dying embers of the fire, as the whole house reverberated with banging, as if a horse was kicking the walls. Smith held up his Bible and shouted, "Demon, can you hear me?" The house suddenly fell silent, as if listening. "If you can hear me," called out the priest, "knock 9 times." At first there was nothing, but then loud, distinct knocks came from within the walls. Everyone counted the knocks in their heads. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Convinced now that he was dealing with some supernatural force, Smith asked the same question in Irish and then Latin, and each time received the same reply: 9 knocks. He asked how many of the people present had been born in County Monaghan, and again received the correct answer in knocks. After a sleepless night, the priest left the house to report to his superior. Bishop McKenna of Clogher was so alarmed by the story that he asked the renowned exorcist Dean Keown to help, but the man refused. Not wanting to send Father Smith back to the house alone, the bishop asked another priest, Father Eugene Coyle from Maguire's Bridge, to accompany him. Coyle was sceptical about the whole thing, but did as he was asked, and waited by the fire for nightfall with Father Smith and the Murphys. As darkness descended, the sound of snoring came from the bedroom. "Who's in there?" asked Coyle. "Nobody," said Anne, the eldest daughter. "We're all here." Coyle lit a candle and went with Father Smith into the empty bedroom, followed by the Murphys' dog. The snoring seemed to be coming from one of the beds, even though it was empty. Coyle stepped closer for a better look, and before his eyes a human shape materialized beneath the sheet. The dog scampered under one of the beds in terror. "You can talk to it," whispered Smith from behind Father Coyle. "Watch." Now Smith stepped forward and said, "Whatever this there, I would ask you, if you have the power, could you put the dog out from under the bed?" The colour drained from Coyle's face as he watched the shape squirm and rise, transforming into some sort of animal. It made a spitting noise, which sent the Murphy's collie bolting from the room. Coyle now had a question of his own. "Where do you come from?" When he got no answer, he asked, "Are you from hell?" The shape beneath the sheet hissed angrily and then disappeared. The priests pulled back the sheet, but there was nothing unusual to be seen. Coyle, in a state of shock, sat on the bed to recuperate. After a few moments, he felt something move beneath the sheet, under his hand. Later, he described it as feeling like a squirming rat or a wriggling eel. The two priests left the house the following morning, shaken by their encounter. By this stage, there were all sorts of rumours circulating in the locality about the Murphy family. People said that James Murphy was practicing the dark arts in the house and had summoned monsters, using a book he had found in the forest called The Legions of Demon. Others claimed to have seen a small white pig following the children in the forest. They presumed the animal was a demon of some sort, because the Murphys didn't own pigs. The Murphy girls were shunned in their embroidery class. It was all very upsetting. Others accused the Murphys of playing tricks on the priests. "Do you think it's all an elaborate hoax?" Coyle asked Smith on their way back to the house for another night on duty. Smith shook his head. "But maybe we should try to prove that it's not the children tricking us." "What do you mean?" Smith came up with a plan. He invited some of the more suspicious neighbours around to the house and told them to hold the hands and feet of each of the Murphy children to prevent them from secretly making knocking sounds. The neighbours obeyed, but as the light faded, the knocking on the walls began again and grew in intensity. The neighbours, now convinced that the children weren't the culprits, glanced at each other in terror. One of the men let out a painful groan. "What's wrong?" asked the neighbour. "Someone is after punching me." Another farmer, a big strong fellow, fell to the floor. "Something pushed me." The neighbours fled the house, now convinced that the haunting wasn't a hoax and adamant that they would never set foot in that infernal cottage again. The two priests returned to the cottage 50 times in total and witnessed all manner of disturbing things, like pots, pans and plates being flung across the kitchen, beds being lifted off the floor and sheets and pillows being tossed off the beds. A third priest visited the house 16 times and experienced the same things. When he asked the ghost to whistle, it did, and it could also tap out tunes like Boyne Water and the Soldier's Song. Other visitors to the house also encountered the ghost. A famous horse dealer from England arrived with a group of men to experience the haunting. He asked the ghost how many of the men with him had been born in Ireland. He received the correct reply in knocks. When he asked how many of the men were horse dealers, a knocking came from under his own chair. The only thing that seemed to silence the ghost was when Mass was said in the kitchen. The poltergeist also reacted badly to Holy Communion and holy water. A fourth priest, Robert Hugh Benson, was asked to investigate the haunting, but mysteriously died before his planned visit. Indeed, the three priests who had spent time in the house all suffered bad after effects of the haunting. One had a nervous breakdown, another contracted spinal meningitis, and the third suffered from facial paralysis. In the end, the Murphys fled the cottage for America, boarding a ship to New York on the 31st of July 1915. Some said the poltergeist followed them, continuing to haunt them by knocking and banging on their cabin walls on the ship, to such an extent that other passengers complained to the captain. Very little is known about what happened to the Murphys after that, though it was said that one of the girls spent the rest of her life in a mental institution.
Not paranormal. Mark Manning is real. Now that's a scary thought.
Now, dear listener, if you're lucky in life, every so often you get to talk to somebody truly extraordinary, and my next guest falls right into that category. His name is Father Michael Collins. You can read about him on fathermichaelcollins.com because, as I said, he's truly extraordinary. He is not only an ordained priest in the Catholic Church for the last 40 years, but an author of several books, as well as being accomplished in the area of studies like philosophy of Greek and Roman and archaeology. He has taught in several universities, indeed in Rome, like the American University. He tells me he's about to release a book shortly to mark the soon-to-be canonization, I think it's at the end of April, of Carlo Acutis, who was a software whiz, and he was only 15 years of age when he died in 2006. And in that short space of time, he managed to make such an impression that he will be a saint. But it's of devils and stuff we started our conversation with, namely exorcism. So get yourself a cup of coffee or tea, sit down, relax, and eavesdrop on our conversation.
But anyway, going back to your question about exorcism, it's a thing that a lot of people don't really understand. But bottom line is everybody understands the difference between good and evil, what the right, moral, upright and honourable thing to do is, and then what the cheap and easy way to cheat people is as well. And so many of us are tempted. It's a bit like sugar. We know sugar's bad for us. We know that it can give us cancer. We know that it can give us headaches. It can change our mood, our energy levels, etc. And yet we all have sugar, and we know that we should avoid it. So it's a bit, I think that's a simile for avoiding evil and doing good. Unfortunately, very few of us manage to do it. But at the same time, certainly from the Christian and the Jewish and the Islamic traditions, and indeed, I think you'd probably say for most religions in the world, the call is to do good and at minimum do no harm. We're aware that evil exists, and in the Jewish and Christian traditions, we've characterized this as an actual personage. Now, that's following in the Christian tradition the words of Jesus, who referred to the devil virtually as a personage, but it was still a personage which held rejection of God. According to the tradition, Satan is an angel who was in the presence of God, who rebelled and turned against God. But Jesus was, trying to get this idea across of negative actions to try and do things which are honourable and just.
I think the problem as well, Father, is that people's idea of exorcism largely goes back to, maybe Hollywood, the Hollywood movies. How different is the real thing from what we see in films?
I think it's very, very different. I mean, cinema obviously has to rely on sound, on exaggerated images. It's got to capture a lot of things within a few seconds. This film is so expensive to make. So, yes, I've never actually witnessed an exorcism, but I've witnessed and seen people being prayed over very, very many times. And it's just something very normal and relaxed, if you like. It's praying for somebody perhaps who's sick, praying for somebody who's troubled, praying for somebody in difficulty. So it's literally just joining in a fraternal prayer, being present with that person, and then asking God to listen to our prayers and to restore the person and to help the person in whatever way that they would need and whichever is appropriate for their beneficial curing.
And are there certain things, say like games and rituals or even places, that you'd caution people to avoid dabbling in, just to be safe?
Not really, no. I think in actual fact, I wouldn't be concerned about people going into areas where, for example, some people would say, oh, don't dabble with tarot cards, or don't dabble with the occult, don't dabble with Ouija boards or whatever. I'd actually say, on the contrary, the road to uprightness, the road to perfection, the road to happiness is, in fact, just following your conscience rather than anything else, and doing as best you can so that you live by the old golden rule, which is to do no harm to anybody and to do unto others as you'd like them to do to you. So that's the concept. And therefore, there are so many things that we need to do. For example, when you've got the opportunity to defraud somebody and you're tempted to defraud them, and in particular, if you think you could defraud them without them noticing and maybe getting you into trouble, well, you just don't do that because it's not the right thing. I remember my father, funny enough, when I was probably about 14 or 15, one day we were having a cup of tea in the kitchen and we were chatting about various things, and he said to me, never take a brown envelope. And I was thinking that's a very funny thing, but I was too young to understand until he explained it to me.
And for those of you outside of Ireland, a brown envelope was a euphemism for a bribe.
He was an architect, and in his day there was a lot of brown envelopes being exchanged around Dublin between politicians and builders and architects.
Very much.
So there's a lot of that, and we're going back to the 70s and 80s. And he said, Michael, never do something that you'd be ashamed of by the time evening arrives. I always thought to myself, that's a kind of quite a challenge. But the older I've got and the longer I've lived, I've realised that it's true. We're often tempted to do things which, in the heat of the moment, we might say, oh, I'll get away with that, or I'll do that, or maybe it's not going to harm anybody in particular. But in actual fact, as you know, it does. It harms both you and harms the person that you're harming.
Like, what's the most common misunderstanding people have about demonic activity or spiritual oppression, say?
I think probably, I'm not an expert, but my guess is going to be that the devil is a semi-comical figure with a tail and a trident in his hands and a red cape, and is wandering around like an anti-Superman, trying to get people into trouble. I don't think it's quite as simple as that. As I say, I see it much more in terms of the choice of the conscience, the choice of the individual who can live out their lives as best they can, doing good and avoiding evil.
Right.
That having been said, within all of us, we all have different personalities, and many of us have what we could perhaps call personality traits and failings, and therefore we're not able, despite our best efforts or our best, our best efforts really, despite that, we're not able to do the right thing, and we fall into waysides, and we end up wasting the talents which we have and wasting so much energy and achieving very little. We're assailed by so many things that just bombard us, and it's so difficult to resist that. I remember seeing a wonderful movie about 20 years ago. It came out called The Great Silence. Does that ring a bell with you? It was set in a Carthusian monastery.
No, it's the only bell it rings with me is when I'm in trouble with my wife.
No, this is a different one. Okay,
I get a big silence. A frosty one.
Exactly what you mean.
Yeah.
I know exactly what you mean. Now, this was a wonderful movie. It was made by a celebrated filmmaker whose name I can't remember, but he wrote to a monastery. He wrote to the abbot of a monastery in Switzerland, and he said, I'd love to come over one time and do a short movie, perhaps an hour or so, documentary about your lifestyle, because you live in virtual silence apart from an hour or two in the day when you get together and you have common recreation. But the rest of the day you spend in prayer and silence, and even your meals are taken listening to readings from the Bible or holy books. And it sounds fascinating, but I think what he also meant was it sounds rather extreme. So after 13 years, he got a reply from the abbot who said, thank you for your letter, which I received some years ago, and I'm certainly going to give it more consideration. So another few years went by, and I think this man had written back and said, oh, that's wonderful, thank you, because he'd virtually forgotten about it and given up. So eventually, a few years later, the abbot wrote back and said, as I mentioned in my last letter, I was thinking about it and I'm happy for you to come. So the guy went off into this charter house, this beautiful old monastery way up in the hills. I think it was Switzerland or the south of France. I just have a blank at the moment where it was. But the deal was he could only bring in a handheld camera, and all right, already in the 2000s, digital tape was available and very high quality, but he agreed to the terms that he'd come in and he wouldn't cause any disturbance. So he just walks around the monastery, and I think the film ended up being about 2.5 hours. I'm sure some listeners will remember seeing the movie in the IFI, or you can even get it on DVD now. But there's almost complete silence apart from a little bit of singing in Gregorian chant in Latin, music which would date back more than 1,000 years. And that's it. And people were fascinated with that movie because it opened a window into a world of which they were completely unaware. And these men, and indeed there are women in these enclosed convents who embrace a life of silence, they're so content, contemplative, peaceful, tranquil at what they're doing, just concentrating on the beauty of the world all around them. And even in a cold cell, and it's the middle of winter and the snow outside, even still, these monks are very quietly, each sitting in their own cell, praying, then going down to the chapel for common prayer. And there's something like that, then your mind is totally concentrated on God. Now, for most of us, I'd say 99.9% of us, that's so extreme that we wouldn't be able for that aesthetic way of life. But what I think most of us need is to have a little time in our day that we can be completely silent and tune in with the divine. And just to give you an example, there are spots all over the country where this is possible. I'm sure you're aware of Glenstall Abbey in Limerick, County Limerick.
Do you know, just as you were talking to me, I was saying to myself, I've got to ask him about that, because I tell you what I used to do, Father, and I still do occasionally. I get up here, I'm a voiceover guy for my living, right? And I have a studio outside the house, and I'd often come in early in the morning and I'd log into their website because they've got a webcam, and I'd listen to the matins, is that what they're called?
That's right.
And it's beautiful. And I look at them and I kind of envy that simplicity and yet intensity, if that doesn't sound like a contradiction, it probably does.
And the contradiction, yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's that kind of intense concentration.
Yeah, and again, it goes back to what you were saying, about the devil inside, essentially, as opposed to kind of a third party. I think there's a divide itself. The negative.
And Plato talks about that. You're right. Even Plato talks about the appetite to do the right thing, and then the urges, which are our appetites, which draw us off invariably to do the wrong thing. Going back to the sugar analogy, so much of our energy is taken either devouring sugar or avoiding devouring sugar, but we don't have time to do the healthy things which build up our body. But mentioning that monastery of Glenstal, one of the fundamental things of all Benedictine monasteries, indeed all religious houses, is that anybody who knocks on the door is to be welcomed. And St. Benedict, who wrote his rule or his way of living 1,500 years ago, he said in the chapter on hospitality, he said, anybody who presents themselves at the door must be welcomed as Christ himself visiting. So it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're Christian, whether you're whatever, any religion or none, you've got to be welcomed. And they always have a guest room and etc. So every monastery will have an area which is a guest house. Now, Glenstal was very lucky about 20 years ago because an American lady visited. She was Presbyterian. She didn't know much about the Catholic Church, but she happened to be in Ireland on a visit, called into Glenstal. She met some of the monks, became friendly with them. Then within maybe 2 years or so, she gave them a very large sum of money. She was very wealthy from her background in America, and she gave them a very large sum of money to build a new guest house so that they could no longer just have 3 guests in their little guest house because they'd only 3 bedrooms, and it's now about 12 bedrooms. And she herself actually converted to become a Catholic sometime after that. But the curious thing is, I've been going there for 40 years. Anytime I've tried to get in nowadays, it's always full. So all these places, the more the world is alluring and distracting, etc., the more people want to go away. And the monasteries offer a wonderful place of hospitality, first of all, and then you're just left to your own devices. If you want to talk to monks, maybe discuss issues or concerns or tease out elements of your faith which you're interested in, they're there to facilitate that, and you can do that either on a one-to-one basis, or you can maybe sometimes join some of the retreats which they organise. And I go on a retreat to a beautiful French monastery every year, which is absolutely beautiful. And it's in France. It's called Solesmes, and it's very famous. I mentioned Gregorian chant. It's very famous for its beautiful Latin music, most of which goes back 1,000 or 1,400 years. And it's beautiful to step into a tradition. It's like stepping into a river, and the waters are cool, but they're still flowing around you. So you feel this is a lived-in place. There's been monks here for hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of years, one generation after the other. And as one generation dies, new novices present themselves at the door of the monastery to join. And that's the way it's been. And curiously, religious life in France, for example, which in large parts the population had lost interest in their Christian faith. So many of these monasteries are very well attended and quite full, you could say, because they have a certain amount of people who've decided this is the way of life for me. I love this tranquility. I love the routine, as you mentioned, getting up from Athens early in the morning, getting the day underway. They have prayer, they have common work, then they have a little recreation, and then they have their meals and rest time. So those 4 parts of the day gel very well. So therefore, going back to your original question about exorcism is really an attempt at an operation. It is an operation to try and help a patient who is sick. So exorcism is simply recognizing that somebody has a spiritual dis-ease or disease within them. Yes. And this has to be, it has to be addressed. And sometimes it can be addressed very quietly. You can talk to the person, and a bit like a psychologist or a psychiatrist would deal with their clients or patients, and then the patient would respond by trying to modify their way of living. It's the same type of thing. So, as I say, what you're talking about, Hollywood and fire and brimstone and all that type of stuff, that's not how it happens at all. Very often it's just going to be a very quiet dialogue, and asking the person how they feel. So the idea of having, as it was in the Old and New Testament, with Satan responding and shouting and screaming, I think, Hollywood is exactly the word you're looking for.
Yeah, but I think, historically there were cases kind of like that, I suppose, I'm
not denying that. I'm sure there, and there probably still are. There could be, but that probably is, first of all, that could be the interaction that a religious would have with a person who is virtually their whole personality has been taken over by evil. And that can happen. There's absolutely no doubt about it. I mean, look at adolescence. I haven't seen it yet, but that's the talk of the town. And funny enough, I've just written a short book on a young English boy. Well, he's barely English. He's actually born in London, but at the age of 3 months, his parents brought him back to Italy, where he grew up to the age of 15. He was, by all accounts, all his family and contemporaries say he was a very good person. He went to Mass every day, prayed the Rosary. He helped in Mother Teresa's missionary house in Milan, and he helped at the Capuchin soup kitchen. And yet, at the age of 15, he was struck down with leukemia and was dead 11 days later. So he's actually going to be canonized by the Pope at the end of April, on the Sunday, the 27th of April. And he is an example of somebody who was a good person, and yet also was struck down. But people respond to his goodness, and they're fascinated by the integrity of his life. And funny enough, I was on a radio program recently, and somebody was talking about sanctity and what is a saint. And a saint is, after all, just an ordinary Christian who's trying to live out an ordinary life and achieve holiness. And holiness is simply being wholly integrated in yourself, so that you're not, a Jekyll and Hyde character. So it's a kind of a journey. Christian life, of course, and all life is just a journey. So it's a journey of integration, putting aside things which distract us, which do nothing to help our personalities grow, but in fact stunt us and dissipate our energy. And then that wholeness, which allows us to concentrate and have this lovely vision of God. And this young boy, whose name was Carlo Acutis, had a lovely expression. He said, some people sit in the sun to get a tan, but if we sit before God in the tabernacle, in the Christian tabernacle, we are bathed in the light of Christ. It was a lovely image. And he also then reflected on the world, and he said, I pass the football stadiums and the cinemas, and there's queues of young people going into concerts and all these types of things, but I go into a church and it's almost empty. So what's gone wrong here? And again, this is what we're talking about. I'm not saying that the devil is out printing tickets for Ticketmaster, but it's probably true that many of us spend our money frivolously, and it's always been thus. We spend our money frivolously when we could do something really worthwhile with not just our money, but with our talents, with our time, with our energy.
I'm thinking about, you say, going into a church. Isn't it amazing that I go into one up the road here in Booterstown every so often? And what is that? When
most of what we understand in the world, we don't really understand. I don't understand the physics of how the world keeps together, and yet I know lots of friends who are interested in maths and physics and science, and they'd have they'd have a lot better idea than I would have. But then sometimes you can just intuit, and you don't need to know an awful lot. And funny, I was at a talk at the Oxford Literary Festival a few days ago, given by a chap called Alistair McGrath, who's quite a well-known theologian come scientist. He held a chair of religion and science in Oxford until 2 years ago, and he started off as an agnostic, then became an atheist, and then became Christian. So he's an elderly man now. I'd say he's, actually maybe he's not. Perhaps he's only in his very early 70s, but he's written several books, and one of the books which he's recently written is Why It's Important to Believe. And he talked about that dichotomy, that the finite mind, which we have as humans, is by definition incapable of understanding infinity. And one of the great attributes, according to Thomas Aquinas, of God is infinity, that God is beyond any measurement that we can calibrate with or understand. So I often think of that as consolation. If I don't understand many of the contradictions in religious faith, well, then I'll say, well, that's okay. It's not important for me to understand. The fact is I give my assent to what I do understand in the hope that the rest of it will fall into place. A little bit like when you give a promise to somebody or you make an oath. You can only do so within your own limitations. And then the rest, you hope, is going to be taken up either by the other person or the other issue that you've made the oath to or the promise to.
Father, do you believe that some people are just born evil?
No, I don't. Funny enough, I'm thinking back to something my mother said many years ago. She said, nobody's born to do evil in the world. You know, we're born as infants. But I think what is true is that all of us are, what the buzzword now is, neurologically diverse. So there's no such thing as the standard issue, run-of-the-mill human being. It doesn't exist. We don't exist as that perfect person. So everybody who's born, just like in the same way that we all have a different iris or a different fingerprint, one from the other, in the same way we all have a different approach to our morality. But I think what's probably true is there are some people who have such a conscience that they can see no wrong in stealing from another person or doing another person ill or premeditating to harm that person or even to kill them. That is true. And that is, in a sense, and again, I'm no psychiatrist, psychologist, I couldn't say this, but it's something neurologically they're differently wired from the majority, because fortunately the majority of people don't think along those lines. We just get along. You know, we all have Homo sapiens were, 160,000 years or sort of million years, I can't remember now, evolving from much more basic primates. So we are constantly refining our reasoning and our understanding. So in answer to your question, what I'm trying to say is no, I don't believe that somebody is born intrinsically evil or intrinsically good. I think we're born in such a way that we've got to use our talents and, again, stay away from those things which would lure us to the side of evil or lure us to doing things which are harmful, which are psychopathic actions, that they're against what society accepts as the norm. So that brings you back into the whole area of what it is and how it is acceptable to do certain things. For example, I was in an archaeological dig a few years ago, about 5 or 6 years ago, a place called Aproperte in Spain. And the archaeologist who was leading the seminar that we were attending was explaining that the cave, which we just visited, was a place where children were evidently sacrificed and humans ate flesh. And he gives the whole reason. I won't need to go into that at the moment. But just think that was hundreds of thousands of years ago. But it's something that within parts of society even still exists, as far as I understand today. But there's some parts of humanity which would accept cannibalism as, not morally reprehensible. And it probably was much more so in the past, but that's kind of been pruned out of society or shaved away.
If I can, while I have you, and you've been more than generous with your time. Did you see that movie Conclave?
I did, yes, I did. I thought the movie was good. It probably could have been a little bit better, and the ending was pretty silly. But the movie itself was very good. But the book was better, actually.
You say and we won't give away any spoilers, but you say the ending was silly. But would that be something that you wouldn't agree with, or is it not a sign of the world we're living in at the moment?
No. What happens is I've read most of Robert Harris's books, and they all they're fabulous as you go along. And then just he runs out of interest, or he can't think of a good end to the story, and plunk, they fall down. It's a bit like the
let's just end it. Let's just butcher
modem.
the ending. Yeah,
the dial-up modem, and then suddenly, boom,
yeah.
it was gone.
Oh dear. And folks, I really did have to butcher the end of that for reasons of time. My thanks, of course, to the Squire, aka David McGlynn, to Ciarán Fanning, the author of Haunted Ireland, and of course, who you've just heard, Father Michael Collins, for helping me put together, well, this episode of Scary Eire. Could you believe we're into 13 episodes now? Next time you'll be joining us, I'll be talking to Bertie Brosnan, who has compiled a history of the Battle of Clontarf. What's that, says you? Well, it's basically when us Irish got rid of the Vikings, as we got rid of many other invaders to come throughout the years. And also a battle of avian sorts. Would you believe there was an honest-to-goodness true battle of the birds in Cork in the 1600s. They actually massacred each other. Two different flocks of birds gathered over the days and then just went into battle. It's fascinating stuff. So do join me, Mark Manning, next time around on your Scary Eire.
Scary Eire.
Scary Eire.
Goodbye. Take care, 'cause I care.